All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here about the Spanish-American War. This is in our unit, America Grows as a World Power. So we're going to be taking a look at some lessons here about how America has grown and will continue to grow in international affairs and world affairs as well. So objectives and standards: to explain the causes and effects of the Spanish-American War and to identify the impact the war had on the U.S. as a world power. And take a moment there to look over the standards, please. And our desired result, remember to include this in your weekly summary, please, under the desired result section. This is the question you're going to be thinking about throughout the entire lesson and need to respond to as well. How did the Spanish-American War impact the United States and others? So growing concerns. In the late 1800s, we've kind of discussed this already, but the United States was beginning to expand its economic power around the world. However, the United States was not quite willing to go to war over colonies or power. We see a lot of European countries at this time, France and England and Germany and Belgium, going to war or fighting with each other in places like Africa and Asia and elsewhere for control of these different colonial locations. But the United States is really not ready to do that. But that will begin to change in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. So Cuba and Spain. The end of the 1800s saw Spain as a declining world power, but Spain is still going to control some territories, including Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Now, American entrepreneurs had invested $50 million in sugar plantations in Cuba, and they see Cuba as a growing opportunity by 1897. Now, the island nation of Cuba, though, was very unstable, and they're looking for independence from Spain. Now, a Cuban patriot by the name of Jose Marti, I believe I'm pronouncing his name correctly, had launched a war for independence against Spain in 1895. However, the Cubans were unsuccessful, and many were placed in relocation camps where they died of disease and starvation by the Spanish. And that's a picture of Jose Marti there for you. So, supporting a struggle. There were many Americans who supported the Cubans in their struggle for independence. They see it as a representation of the American colonies. If you remember back to the American Revolutionary War, thinking about the American patriots fighting against the British for freedom. So many Americans compare the Cubans fighting the Spanish to our own kind of history. Now, there were some entrepreneurs that hoped that Spain would end the revolt in Cuba as well to protect their interests. But brutal tactics by the Spanish, such as the relocation camps and also the destruction of American property, angered many in the U.S. Now, media influence in the United States also played a role in this. There's something called yellow press, and we can still kind of see examples of it today. Yellow press is sensationalized headlines and stories. So think about like when you go to the supermarket or the grocery store and you see those supermarket tabloids, right, that say, woman gives birth to, 900-pound baby. You kind of know the story's not real, but you can't help but maybe want to pick it up and read it and see what's going on, right? So those are those sensationalized headlines and stories, and those come about during the Spanish-American War from newspaper editors such as Joseph Pulitzer, his picture is right down here, and William Randolph Hearst, okay, both two big newspaper editors of the time. Now, they both told of Spanish atrocities and compared Cuban rebels to colonial American patriots. Now, Spain was urged to establish peace quickly, with the Cuban rebels, or the United States would become involved. This came from President William McKinley. He's the top picture here. So he tells Spain basically, hey, get together with Cuba, work out a peace between you guys, or otherwise the United States, we're going to have to step in and take some action. Spain kind of ignores the request and refuses to do anything, so McKinley orders the USS Maine to Havana Harbor in Cuba to protect American citizens. Moving towards conflict. So February 1898, a letter from Spain's ambassador to Washington, D.C. Was leaked to William Randolph Hearst, sorry. The letter called President McKinley a weak and stupid politician, and this angered many Americans and fueled bitter relations with Spain. Following the letter, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in Cuba on February 15th, 1898. There's a depiction of what happened there. You can see in the picture there. And it resulted in the deaths of 266 Americans. Now, an investigation was launched, and the investigation declared that a mine had blown up the ship. Now, most Americans are going to blame Spain for this, and they're going to look to take action. Now, years later, investigations are unclear if a mine caused the explosion. Many historians tend to believe that it was a boiler in the ship or some type of mechanical function or misfunction in the ship that caused it to explode. But either way, this is kind of the final straw, the final event that caused for Americans to want to go to war with Spain. So the beginning of war. The call for war, raged across the United States. There's newspapers, there's songs, there's slogans. They're all going to call for war with Spain. Spain did agree to many American demands, such as to abolish relocation camps in Cuba and to other concessions as well. However, the agreements were too late, and President William McKinley went to Congress on April 11th, 1898, and he's going to ask for a declaration of war against Spain, and Congress will approve it 8 days later. Now, Spain will declare war on the United States in response to this, so the Spanish-American War has now begun. So fighting begins in the Philippines. Many Americans responded to the call for troops by President William McKinley. 200,000 men volunteered to fight the Spanish, and fighting will take place in different locations around the world, including in the Pacific, in such places as the Philippines, and in the Caribbean, like in Cuba and Puerto Rico. You can see here on the map, I've kind of tried to identify where the Philippines are for you. So this is in the Pacific Ocean. You can kind of see on the world map here where we're located. So we'll talk about fighting in the Philippines, first. So May 1st, 1898, U.S. Commodore George Dewey, his picture's right here for you. He moved American ships into the Spanish-controlled Manila Bay in the Philippines, and they completely caught the Spanish off guard, and they quickly destroyed their forces. Now, another man, Emilio Aguinaldo, I'm trying to pronounce his name properly, a Filipino nationalist in the Philippines, and others with him, are going to help the U.S. defeat the Spanish army as well, because they're looking for independence from Spain as well. In August of 1898, just a couple of months later, Spain will surrender to U.S. forces in the Philippines, so the fighting in the Philippines will cease during the Spanish-American War. So conflict in Cuba. American troops landed in Cuba in June 1898, and Guantanamo Bay was quickly captured by U.S. Marines and forces under U.S. Army General William Shafter, who stormed ashore at Santiago. American forces did there. There's a picture of them there for you. However, American troops were ill-prepared in terms of supplies and training. Soldiers had obsolete weapons and clothing that was not suited for the Cuban environment. We're talking about guys in heavy uniforms, cotton uniforms in tropical environments. It's just not very practical. They also had to deal with spoiled food sometimes. Now, many soldiers became sick and died from diseases as well. The majority of American casualties during the Spanish-American War will be from diseases. We'll have some that do die in combat, but majority of them will die from diseases. Now, despite challenges, American troops did fight hard in Cuba, and many received recognition. We have the 9th and 10th African American Regiments. I have a picture of them down here, you can kind of see. And then Theodore Roosevelt, yep, the president, but he's not president yet at this point. His Rough Riders, this is them after charging up San Juan Hill, which played a big role in bringing about an end to the Spanish-American War. So the end of the Spanish-American War. Excuse me. In July 1898, in a desperate attempt to escape 2 days after the Battle of San Juan Hill, the Spanish were blockaded in the harbor. Now, American forces destroyed the Spanish fleet as they tried to escape, and in Santiago, Spanish forces surrendered. Now, there were a few battles in Puerto Rico that will remain, which was another Spanish-controlled territory, but overall the fighting does stop. In all, about 3,000 Americans died in the fighting, like I said earlier, mostly from diseases, while about 380 died in combat. Now, December 1898, the Treaty of Paris officially ends the war between the U.S. and Spain. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam will be given up by Spain, and the United States will buy the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. Now, Cuba was to remain an independent nation according to the Teller Amendment. We'll talk more about that later on. However, the U.S. will look to take control of the Philippines, which angered some Americans and Filipinos. And Guam will be used for naval and strategic purposes, while the U.S. will also gain control of Puerto Rico later on as well. All right. So our closure. How did the Spanish-American War impact the United States and others? Think about the overall causes of the war. Why did the United States become involved in it? What are they kind of looking to do? And think about the result of it. How does the United States begin to expand its global power and control following the fighting? And how does this impact other people possibly, like Cubans, like Puerto Ricans, like Filipinos and people like that? How do you think that's going to impact them as well? I hope you have a great rest of your day or night. Please let me know of any questions or concerns, and hope to talk to you soon.